Thank you so much. Thank you, Danila, for that very generous introduction. It's so exciting to see you all here. As Danila mentioned, my name is Allison Cohen. I work on socially beneficial applications of artificial intelligence technology. And as Danila also mentioned, I work with Mila, which is the world's largest deep learning research institute. So the title of my talk today is Why Take a Unidimensional Approach to Tools that are Built on High Dimensional Space, which is just a really nerdy way of saying that AI and the impact that it has is highly complex. And we should therefore be building AI in a way that reflects this complexity, especially if we have any hope of doing socially meaningful work. So I am so excited to be here today because, like you, I am incredibly passionate about the field of artificial intelligence. To illustrate my point, if you're walking around the downtown core of a major city, chances are you'll be quite impressed by the large skyscrapers that seem to extend far above the clouds. But in the future, I think we'll marvel at how those skyscrapers have integrated AI algorithms that capture pollution, weather metrics, in order to regulate the building's energy consumption. Now, the problem that I want to suggest to you today is that too often, AI tools are built in the way that I imagine a contractor builds a skyscraper, approaching the task as if it were exclusively an engineering problem. In practice, this approach I find to be a stripped-down abstraction, missing layers of dimension that are critical to AI's impact in practice. So over the course of today's talk, I'm going to share with you some of the best practices that I've learned in creating built-for-purpose AI tools, tools that reflect the messiness, the complexity, the interconnectedness of our world. And I think the reason that this work isn't being done more has to do with a very popular misconception. And that misconception is that AI is just a tool. Can you just put your hand up really quickly if you've heard this statement being said before? AI is just a tool. Yes, okay, I can't see. Yes, it's a lot of you, if not all. Okay, perfect. Thank you for confirming. So to demonstrate the misconception of AI as just a tool, I want you to imagine a continuum. This continuum can be used to plot the full spectrum of human-made tools, from those that are highly technical, on the side that I've called low-dimensional, it's on the left-hand side, to those that are more complex, maybe from a sociological or an anthropological standpoint, which I've put on the right. These are called high-dimensional. Bear with me. We're going to get somewhere, I promise. So on the low-dimensional side, I would put a wrench, for example. I would argue that the wrench is fairly low-dimensional in that its application is quite clear. Its existence doesn't suggest anything particularly meaningful about our society. And its use isn't time-bound. It's used very consistently across time. The wrench is notably different from something more abstract, something more multidimensional, like art, for example. And that's what I've put on the other side of the spectrum. This might look like just an upside-down urinal, but this is actually Duchamp's fountain, a ready-made sculpture from 1917 that challenged popular notions of what art is by criticizing the value that people placed on aesthetics and inspiring them to think of art as something that stimulates intellectual reflection. This piece was initially rejected from art exhibitions and later became an icon of the 20th century art world. So as you can see, this isn't just a tool, it's something more abstract, something that can be studied for its social, historical, and anthropological context. So I would argue that on this continuum, applied AI projects are much closer to art than they are to the wrench. Unlike a wrench, it is less clear when AI ought to be used. We depend on our social conventions and expectations to decide things like whether we feel that legacy data has something useful to say about the future, whether we feel we want certain outcomes to be systematically reproduced, and whether we feel that the tool has a sufficient level of confidence to be considered socially accepted when deployed. Like art, we can use AI and analyze AI to deduce an unbelievable amount of information about our society. If you look at the face of AI, it is overwhelmingly male. You might see that around this room. It comes with its benefits, though, because I didn't have to wait in line for the bathroom. That was a first. It also comes from people that have very specific backgrounds, very specific privileges, and that speaks to things like gender norms, systemic racism, and wealth inequality. It can also be used to understand the financial interests at play when you see what problems have been deemed worthy of solving by artificial intelligence. And finally, we can use our tools to understand popular notions of morality and ethics by seeing the extent to which our rights and freedoms have been upheld or systematically ignored in the context of our AI tools, and whether stakeholder consultation and ethical reflection have been deemed relevant or necessary. Finally, the wrench was originally patented in 1835, and it's been used for the same purpose ever since. Art, by contrast, is very much grounded in time. It's an artifact of its time. I think AI can also be considered as grounded in time. It's the technology of our time that determines what kind of data we have access to. It's the social standards and norms of our time that dictate what our models pay attention to. And it's our time-bound beliefs about what's important that we have our models decide to focus on. So hopefully, I've convinced you that AI is not just a tool in the way that a wrench is, but what does that actually mean in practice? What can we do with this information? Well, in reality, there's a lot more dimension to the work that you're doing than those three areas that I just described. But you're going to need frameworks, you're going to need tools to see the dimension of your problem space if you want to have control over the way that your AI products are working in practice. And that's why I've come up with these three inflection points, if you will, three areas that will help you to see the dimension of your problem space. These inflection points are values, people, and process. I'm going to start with values. When I say values, what I mean is an agreed upon sense of the underlying priorities of your tool. The reason it's so important to align on values is because those values will help orient your decisions on a number of design questions. And you might tell me that, well, my team never sat down and talked through what our values were, so we must have a tool that's just value agnostic. And unfortunately, if you don't choose your values will actually choose you. Whether they come in the form of key performance indicators, or financial interests, or simply the implicit beliefs held by members of your team, those values are absolutely there whether you discuss them with your team or not, and they're going to influence the design and shape of your tool. This can be problematic when you think about the fact that that key performance indicator could be click-through rate. The financial interests could be, the specific targeting of particular demographic groups in advertisements, and those implicit beliefs can be that police and law enforcement is the only way to achieve justice in our society. Unless you want to be subject to the values like that, you have to be quite intentional about setting those values and what those values should be. So to give you an example, one of the projects that I'm working on is an AI-powered search engine. It uses data from research, policy, and law on all things associated with AI regulatory developments. So the idea is that, similar to a ChatGPT, you get concise responses to questions associated with global AI policy and law developments. But when creating this tool, we needed to ask ourselves, who's an authority in this space? Should marginalized voices be included in the search summary? And are we comfortable with the fact that our algorithms can only read English language documents and thereby risk taking a relatively North American, Western European approach to the response? So these questions shouldn't be treated lightly. When you think about it, the information that we chose to display to the user would affect the way that they think about their work, potentially even the course of their research, and maybe even the laws and policies of tomorrow. In this context, which is relatively high stakes, it's concerning to think that critical perspectives might be systematically quieted if those perspectives are coming from marginalized communities, which in many cases might be underfunded, or maybe because those mainstream perspectives don't consider the way that existing laws and policies are working to the detriment of certain communities. So keep in mind, this is an AI law and policy tool. Our values were justice and accountability. But given those values, we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot by favoring only the perspectives of the economically enfranchised, the mainstream, the people that are commonly known and often cited. And so we decided that the best approach would be to give our users a bias warning, alerting them to the fact that the data and our algorithms are steeped in bias, encouraging them to look elsewhere for more diversified opinions. We also considered using filters as a way of helping the user search for information coming from people, organizations, and countries that are not often included in the search summary, again, for reasons of the data set skewing towards mainstream perspectives, and that skew, of course, as we know in artificial intelligence, suggests that the output will be in favor of that bias. So these types of decisions, which promote research into alternative perspectives, would allow the tool to exhibit the values that we had set out for it. Again, those of justice and accountability. And what I hope this story shows is that the values that you bring to the project are the values that become systematically encoded and reproduced in your tool. Being intentional about your values allows your tool to help navigate systems that exist outside of your tool. So as we all know, whatever product we launch into the world is not going to be, having its own set of, power-enabling behavior. All of our technology exists in a context of systems of power and oppression, and we need to be very aware and cognizant of those existing power structures if we're going to be intentional about the communities that our technology supports and actively works against. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the amazing work of Sasha Costanza-Chock, who wrote a book called Design Justice, which completely changed my life. I'd really recommend it. And she talks about how it shouldn't just be a group of well-intentioned designers that are sitting around the table and thinking, what should our values be? I've done this before. There's no shame in it. But the truth is, designers also occupy a space of privilege. There's a lot that they don't necessarily see. So it's important that when you're deciding on your values, you engage directly with marginalized communities that might be affected by your tool, so that they can be the ones to define what your values should be. Okay, perfect. So, I'm sorry, here we go. So once you have finalized what your values are, I think it's important to talk more about your people. So to illustrate this point, let's imagine for a second that you're working with the Swedish National Agency for Education, and you'd like to create an ed tech tool that will analyze the sentiments and the behaviors of students online so that you can infer whether there are mental health challenges or learning disabilities that they may be struggling with. What would you need to know before giving the contract to a group of computer scientists out of Waterloo, Canada? Waterloo being one of the hubs of computer science innovation in the Canadian context. Well, you might ask yourself, culturally speaking, there are a couple differences between Swedes and Canadians. I can go into this maybe at a later time, but I know for a fact that this is the case. Does this research group have the sensitivity to our unique cultural context to understand what kind of anomalous behavior is being exhibited by our students? You might also ask yourself, okay, it's a group of computer scientists, but what do they really understand about childhood psychology? Are they working closely with a developmental psychologist? There's a level of expertise there that you need to make sure is embedded on the team. You might even ask, Canadians, they clearly don't care at all about the privacy of their data. They have no policies protecting them. We Swedes, our data is much more important and highly valued. Do they have the training in cybersecurity and in the legal and regulatory framework here to be able to protect the data sufficiently? These are all very good questions and good reasons why you wouldn't hire this Canadian team. It's clear to see that you need a real understanding of the domain and the discipline in order to create tools that will accurately capture the nuance and the intricacy of that domain. So to give you an example of how I've done this in the past, one of the projects that I just completed is called Biasly. It's a tool that can identify misogyny in North American films. It can't do this for sure yet. It's still in the research phase. But the point is, it is a project that is designed explicitly in the domain of gender bias. And the team that I assembled to work on this project was not just natural language processing experts, but also gender studies experts and linguists. And the reason why I worked with this diverse team throughout the entire project lifecycle is because there are many decisions that are made over the course of an AI development project that might seem technical in nature, but really require a deep domain understanding. So in our context, that involved questions like, what even is misogyny, and how do we define it? Probably shouldn't ask our natural language processing experts. We also had to ask ourselves things like, what group of words signal misogyny, and how can we systematically collect those words? It's also with this group that we had to identify the annotators, the expertise that was needed to understand these data points and to evaluate them with a level of sensitivity as to what bias and misogyny really is. And it's this group of experts that helped us locate that expertise and hire them ultimately. Without representation and diversity in expertise, the tools are obviously ignorant to the realities on the ground, which is where your tools are being deployed. In the best case scenario for us, that would mean that the tool became completely meaningless and useless. But in a worst case scenario, this tool would be taken seriously. informing people of what misogyny is in problematic ways, maybe even not flagging misogynistic text, and giving people who are expressing misogyny validation and support that what they're saying isn't in fact misogynistic. So multidisciplinary engagement, obviously very important, but there's a piece of it that I often find is missing. And that is the importance of lived experience. So on my project, where we had all these diverse disciplines, I also made sure that every single person was a woman. And that's because each of these people had gender bias affect them in unique ways and brought that lived experience to the table time and time again in ways that really expanded our understanding of the problem and allowed us to make decisions that were more cognizant of those realities. And this is an approach that comes from feminist standpoint theory, which I think has so much to contribute to the field of AI development. Feminist standpoint theory tells us that all knowledge is situated in experience, and all experience is knowledge. I'll say that one more time, because for me this was very important to repeat in order to really grasp. They say that all knowledge is situated in experience, and all experience is knowledge. When it comes to all knowledge being situated in experience, I think it helps add a degree of humility to our views of the world, because all of that knowledge is rooted in who we are as people and our own unique experiences of the world. But when it comes to experience as knowledge, I think what that suggests is that we need to properly value the lived experiences of those that are going to be implicated by our tools' use. We need to be bringing the marginalized communities to the table, valuing them as experts in the way that we compensate them, in the way that we engage with them. I think there are also implications of this for working with annotators. Too many times I've seen annotation work relegated to the sidelines when they have such intimate knowledge about your data, your annotation guidelines and how effective they are, and even the software that they're using. So it's one thing to be specific about your people, it's another to be specific about your process. When I say process, what I mean is considering very thoughtfully how you integrate the people around the table to make sure that they have the space and support that they need to bring their influence to the project. The reason it's important to think about process is because many of the AI applications we're developing are being created in privileged spaces, like a university or tech companies. These spaces can be very far removed from the spaces where the tools are being deployed. For example, one of the projects that I'm working on is a human trafficking detection tool. Obviously, the academic space that I'm occupying is very far away from these clandestine human trafficking rings. And because of that distance, there's so much that we don't know, that we don't understand about the field of human trafficking, for example. And it turns out you can't understand until you speak directly with communities in that space, specifically with human trafficking survivors. So our team, of course, decided to do just that. But before we could engage directly, we needed to attend a 2-day workshop where we understood, or at least we tried to learn, what it meant to engage with human trafficking survivors in survivor-centric ways. Of course, they would be sharing with us very challenging, difficult, triggering stories about what they had experienced. And so we had to be very thoughtful about creating the right kind of room for them to feel comfortable and trusting enough to share those stories. We were guided to think very empowering thoughts about the survivors we'd be working with, and have those empowering beliefs guide our engagement strategy. We learned that the process needed to be holistic. Rather than seeing human trafficking survivors as consultants for hire, we needed to recognize the way that their involvement in our project would contribute to their broader reintegration story. Our job was to create a safer environment where survivors could really feel comfortable and trusting, and that involved examining any oppressive structures that existed within our organization that we might perpetuate in the context of these conversations. I think, not every project is going to be about human trafficking, but we have to all take a considered approach to making the right kind of room for the people around the table to bring their expertise forward. Again, I'm seeing many men in this room, and unless you take a thoughtful approach, for example, to how you make sure that women feel included, that's just one very superficial example, you may not really get all of the value out of each of the people that are sitting around the table, and what that ends up translating into is tokenization. And I'll tell you, the human trafficking survivors we spoke with, if we had just tokenized them and sort of given ourselves a check mark, we worked with human trafficking victims, we would have missed out on such richness in those exchanges. So before I close, I want to share with you a little information about myself. You might have already guessed from the fact that I skimmed over some technical details that I don't actually come from a technical background. I have a bachelor's degree in international development and a master's in global affairs. This photo was taken of me when I was in Sri Lanka as part of my studies, where I worked with the Secretariat for Coordinating Reconciliation Mechanisms, an institute that was responsible for making sure that there was no civil war again in the future and addressing the legacy of the civil war there. So most people give me sort of a strange look and say, how did you end up in AI with that background? And I always say to them, technology is political, and it's economic, and it is social. The stakeholders are varied and they're multidisciplinary, and the outputs extend far past any geographic region. AI is about computer science, without a doubt, but it's also about power, wealth, social change, and sustainable development. I think in order to build meaningful AI products, we have to do so thoughtfully and carefully and inclusively in the way that an artist approaches their work. And that's why it's not just about me, it's also about you. I want to leave you with a question that I think we all have the privilege and the responsibility to ask ourselves routinely. What are the values, people, and processes that will help me capture the dimension of my problem space? I think without this type of reflection, we'll be squandering one of the most powerful scientific achievements of the 21st century, one of the few achievements that can dwarf the skyscraper. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Please, can you stay 1 minute more in case there are questions? This was an incredibly valuable perspective and an applied perspective. Are there questions from the audience? Wow, I cannot see you. Yes, I can see Fatima. Questions in the 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm afraid we only have time for one question, but correct me if I'm wrong. You can make yourself available in the mingling area for more questions, so that problem is solved.
Hi, thank you very much for the incredible talk. I'm Mila from Norfolk. And I was wondering, I was really interested in talking about your project of building this misogyny identifier. And a lot of misogyny is perpetrated by people that don't consider themselves misogynistic, as well as a lot of racism is perpetrated by people who don't consider themselves racist. So how do you navigate serving your the things that you find in such a way that it doesn't turn people away. So if they're just labeled, oh, I'm a misogynist, they might be thinking, oh, no, I'm not a misogynist. I won't listen to this. So how do you navigate that?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. And you've raised a really important point, which is that some of the most problematic instances of misogyny can be very subtle and come from people who don't consider themselves misogynistic. And we saw that as being a real gap in the research, in the market, where you already have all these toxicity detection tools which can flag some of the most egregious behavior, but you don't have tools that can flag subtle misogyny, which is why we cared so much to, for example, use keywords that weren't hyper aggressive, things like she, hers, herself, words that would just suggest there was mention of a woman, and then therefore it's more likely that the misogyny would be subtle in practice. In terms of how you educate people, how do you get people on board? So a really exciting aspect of this work was that we not only flagged misogyny, but we also tried to categorize the type of misogyny being exhibited and even rewrite the text to remove the misogynistic implication. So the goal is not to surveil people and to call them out and yada yada, but the goal was really for this to serve as an educational tool that would help people just be more mindful. And I think a lot of those elements would have to be thought through in the design process and the design interface, so that we really communicated in a respectful way the type of misogynistic implication being exhibited and how someone might change their language. But that would have to be sort of the next phase of our project.
Thank you very much, Allison.
Thank you.
And please accept these flowers from us.
Thank you
And
so much.
please join me in giving a round of applause to Allison Cohen. Thank you very much.